My name is Barrett. I'm an assistant manager in sustainability within Deloitte Africa. I focus on driving circularity solutions across Africa and also serve as the chief of staff for sustainability, climate, and equity across Africa. But today, I'm a very proud podcast host, and I have some incredible panelists with me who I'd love to introduce you to. Firstly, to my right, Janine Osborne, the CEO of Sustainable Seas Trust, the queen of extended producer responsibility in the South African context, without a shadow of a doubt, and I won't allow you to be humble about it. And Dr. Freedom Phillips from the Deloitte Center for Sustainable Progress. Very excited to have you both here today. So today we're erring on the side of controversy, and we're asking a question that I think very few are eager to ask, and even fewer are eager to answer. Are we too late to solve the climate crisis? Have we considered whether or not we're balancing up climate priorities with how practical they are, specifically in developing countries? And I think that, Janine, with your experience across the African continent, you probably have some unique perspectives in the matter. We've seen a lot of really ambitious legislation that's come out, specifically in the circularity space, and a lot of critique of that legislation because of the fact that, sometimes retrofitting European or US standards in a local context doesn't make sense because it doesn't take cognizance of some of the challenges that we experience. It's clear that there is a problem. So if you've read the Deloitte Circularity Gap Report, the world in 2019 was 9.1% circular. And now in 2023, just passed, we were 7.2% circular. So we've seen a decrease. We've broken 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries thus far. And I think that for the last few years, we've been speaking about the fact that we're at a tipping point. Are we edging past that tipping point? Is there still hope? Is this all in vain? I'd love to get some of your perspectives and just leveraging off of your experience in the circularity conversation. Do you see us actually addressing the problem in time before the damage becomes irreversible?
Thanks, Ryan. Those are all really good, perceptive questions. I think the first answer I would give is no. I absolutely, fundamentally, with everything that I am, don't believe that we are too late. And especially within an African context, we are well positioned to respond to the climate crisis, the environmental crisis, the planetary boundary crisis that we're facing because we are innovative. We are able to respond quickly. We are flexible. We are agile. I do think the question around how the developed world context influences the developing world context is an important one. I really believe that we need to think about that quite carefully, how the first world conversation is driving the agenda. I believe that the African voice needs to be heard a lot more strongly. And I think that especially within the context of environmental and sustainable waste management, I think the African population has a lot to offer the global conversation, and especially with the informal sector that is so active in recycling, in waste management, in environmental management. We need to be thinking especially about a just and a fair transition to a circular economy.
There's some brilliant perspectives, and I think something that's quite key for me in terms of understanding and getting some of your insights is we obviously, as an African continent, are very close to the effects of climate change. Something that I always like to say, being quite an open youth activist as well, is we're the first generation to feel the effects of climate change and the last generation that can do anything about it. Now, you've got a lot of high-level corporates across Africa who are saying the global north is actually causing a lot of the destruction and a lot of the pollution. And you look at, for example, donations of secondhand clothing across East and West Africa, which is essentially a dumping of plastic waste with your polyesters, your nylons, and your acrylics. Do you think that we as a continent need to address those challenges? Or do you think we need to start holding the global north accountable for the role that they play in those? There's always a bit of an interesting political dynamic in that, in saying that obviously we endorse the polluter pays principle. How do we start as a continent leveraging our positioning to hold those companies accountable for the damage that they cause when operating within our jurisdictions?
I think we've already started to do that to a certain extent. I mean, if you look at extended producer responsibility within the Southern African context, we've had voluntary extended producer responsibility, which is the polluter pays principle, within South Africa for 25, 30 years already. The producer responsibility organization that I would say has done the best in terms of shifting the perspective around sustainable waste management would be Petco, which is the PET recycling company. And what they actually did was, when China closed their doors to the waste from the world, Petco had already set up the PET recycling infrastructure and sector within South Africa such that we weren't even impacted by the fact that China was no longer accepting PET waste, because they'd established a circular economy for PET within South Africa already by doing very clear research into understanding what lands up on the market in terms of PET, developing the recycling infrastructure that's necessary to actually recycle and reprocess that PET, and then doing R&D, research and development, around end-use products that PET can be recycled into, which means that every single PET bottle, doesn't matter if it's badly designed, actually has a home to go to if it's not littered in the environment. So I think within an African context, yes, we need to be talking about sustainable waste management, but we also need to be talking about the issue of litter, because those are two distinct challenges that we have. We can have the infrastructure, we can have the collection infrastructure, the recycling infrastructure, we can have the end-use products that these things can be recycled into. But if we don't have the behavior that's aligned with that, we're still going to sit with the problem.
That's a very interesting perspective. I think something that stands out to me, and you mentioned recycling. We're very far away from an economy that has no plastics in it, for example. And I think that it's difficult sometimes to draw the line between saying it's the responsibility of the consumer to be responsible in terms of how we deal with our own waste, to ensure that we're recycling. We're helping to potentially drive some separation at source to make the lives of the further downstream recyclers a lot easier. From your perspective, who do you think, or where do you think the buck needs to stop? Do we need to, as industries and producers, start slowly transitioning away from these products, or slowly start further investing in extended producer responsibility and circular solutions, reintegrating into your processes, or endorsing buyback or take-back centers, the likes? Or is it actually a behavioral change that needs to take place? Because we don't need to be using as much plastic as we're currently using. There's nothing that irks me more than going to buy fruits or vegetables that are already in their peel, and you actually have to have layers and layers of plastic, which then just either go to landfill or hopefully get reclaimed by the informal recyclers. So where do you think the buck needs to stop? I think that, in my perspective, a bit of shift has to happen from both. There's a really famous saying that goes, nobody is making a bigger mistake than he who does nothing because they could only do a little. And I think that's very important. But based on your experience, who do you think is more accountable?
I don't think there's anyone that's more accountable than another. I think everyone in the value chain has a role to play. I really do. And we're talking about innovation, we're talking about disruption, and it's all good and well, but there are already well-established interventions in place that are not being taken up by the role players within the value chain. So I think to put all the weight on the consumer is incorrect and unfair, because there are disparities within the consumer sector as well. I mean, you've got your high LSM people that are able, they've got access to resources, they've got access to opportunities, they have, toilets in their houses. And then we've got those in the rural informal settlements that do not have access to all of these things and the resources that the higher ups have. In many, 40%, it's only 40% of South Africans that have access to waste management in any form. Mostly in the rural areas, it's a dump site that they have because they don't even have services that are provided to them. For them, a plastic bag can be reused to take their books to school or to carry their clothing. So I believe if you're going to be banning certain things, you need to be thinking about the rural and the lower income areas as well. There's certain things that can be banned, make no mistakes, like plastics in cosmetic products. There's no reason for plastics in cosmetics.
Right?
Microbeads. There's no reason for that. Those can be banned. But there's certain plastics that are necessary. And then we're talking about design. We're talking about reduction and design. That's higher up in the value chain. Make sure that certain things are designed well. Sanitary pads, for example, they can be designed to be biodegradable. Why not? Because you can't enforce, for example, and now I'm talking about a very interesting topic which I'm passionate about, which is menstrual cups for women. You can't enforce menstrual cups in the rural areas because there are a whole lot of other plethora of issues that people think about around collection of blood. It's used for witchcraft. It's, there's certain things that are really important.
Not cognizant
You're not cognizant of it. So you can't be forcing things like menstrual cups on a certain demographic without thinking it through. But you can be thinking about how to make sure that demographic is considered and make sure that the product is designed well. The thing that you touched on that I'm also passionate about is around the need for plastics in food wastage, or at least preventing food wastage. So people often look at the Woolworths and the retailers and they think, oh, why are you packaging your fruit when it's already in its own packaging, which is true, but there's an extension of shelf life that's necessary as well. So there's food waste that gets negated because of plastic packaging. So we need to think about plastic packaging as fit for purpose and make sure that we are designing it fit for purpose. But I really don't believe in demonizing plastics just as a whole. I think that's also incorrect.
No, I completely agree. And I think a big role in that conversation is the cost implications, right? Especially in a developing country. Something that's clear and that's come across well with you is this is a passion-driven conversation. And good pivot to Freedom Car yourself. Speaking about passion and a lot of your experience from a general developing country's perspective, you've obviously been part of a lot of the really systemic conversations and trying to address the challenges, rolling out actual implementable solutions linked to sustainable development goals and the likes in your experience. But what lessons do you believe Africa as a continent can learn from the experience that you've seen at a global level, working with the DCSP, but also working with your other roles like with the United Nations?
I think the solutions that need to be rolled out need to be fit for purpose and localizable, and are responsive to the unique dynamics of developing and emerging economies. Leveraging the international architecture is one aspect, making sure that that architecture is created with an awareness to those local dynamics, but then also creating the projects that bring forward bona fide livelihood benefits. An example that I like to use is the project known as Oceana. So this is a mangrove restoration that was done in Senegal. It was one of the original Clean Development Mechanism projects. This was then taken by the Livelihood Ventures Fund and enhanced. So just stepping back, Livelihood was a collaboration at that time between IUCN, the Ramsar Convention, Denon, and then going forward, many others. That project engaged upwards of 100 different indigenous communities, indigenous and local communities, was able to, over 10 years, have a bona fide livelihood benefit of 3 to 5 times the household income. So by bringing together communities to restore these mangroves, not only were you able to engage the community in technical capacity building, you were able to engage multi-generational participation in this restorative practice. And when I say mangrove restoration, it seems somewhat esoteric. This is over 10,000 hectares. In context, that's the size of Paris. So over the course of this time, what was done was the local capacity building, the local engagement, and then the generation of gold standard carbon credits over a 25-year investment process. So it created livelihood impacts, it created climate resilience to the community, it gave them greater access to food and clean water sources, and it also created those alternative income streams and technical skills which were very beneficial. So stepping back, this is an example of the international architecture being put in place, and then being able to have local organizations and local communities collaborate to foster sustainable development outputs and impacts at a local level that cut across the climate and nature nexus.
That's brilliant. So you touched on something that I'm really passionate about, which is the opportunity for local communities to get involved in carbon credit generation, right? It develops completely new revenue streams in those communities. And it's been up for quite a lot of dispute recently because a lot of the big companies in the global north are being scrutinized for purchasing carbon credits from regions where they aren't actually causing any damage. It's very far removed from where they're actually having an impact on the environment. Now, that's obviously a balancing up exercise because, yes, although you may be funding projects in Africa where there's carbon credit generation that's taking place or carbon sequestration, you are empowering those communities to develop new revenue streams, leveraging some of Africa's assets. The high renewable energy potential, as an example, a lot of the bio areas, the wetlands that we have available to us. What is your perspective in terms of how the global north and the developing south should be interacting when it comes to creating these opportunities, funding innovation projects, and making sure that the right ecosystem role players are involved in conversations to actually address the root issues?
So I think this goes back to the first question you posed, right? Was, are we moving fast enough? And have we gone too far in terms of breaching those planetary boundaries? And like our counterpart, I agree, we haven't gone too far, but I do think that we need to go much further, much faster together. And by taking a look at the way in which the international community prioritizes these elements, there needs to be very much an internalization in the developed economies of ramping up their broader decarbonization strategies. They very much need to own that transition away, and they cannot just simply, in many ways, outsource by virtue of purchasing whatever the quality of the credit from a developing and emerging economy. That being said, I think focusing on high quality credits is something of great opportunity, right? Making sure that there is robust additionality, that they are of high environmental integrity, that they do embed broader sustainable development outputs. These are critical components of the type or the suite of offset credits or credit, be that climate or nature, that you would be looking to generate. But from our work at the international level and with our clients globally, there is an authenticity with many of our leaders to the type of project that they are working towards. There has been, right, as already noted in The Guardian, amongst many other news sources, some concerns around the long-term viability, the authenticity of those reductions. Organizations are subsequently owning those and becoming direct investors in those types of projects, giving them a greater degree of control, giving them the ability to align their purpose, mandate, their mission with the particular outcome that they're looking to foster. That's not to say that the international mechanism isn't of value. The recently agreed Sustainable Development Mechanism, which we expect to be finalized at COP29 in Baku, is a great area of opportunity. So being able to allow for either country to country investments or from technology providers to then externalize those environmental opportunities, I think is really the way that you're able to disseminate some of the broader technology and innovation necessary for us to foster this green economy that we're looking to see post 2030. That being said, it needs to come with the complementary capacity building and requisite finance elements to allow those to be operationalized in capacity constrained jurisdictions. Let's not fool ourselves when we're talking about developing and emerging economies. You can't just create a law and expect it to then manifest the outcome that you want. You need to have the complementary architecture that empowers the local communities and frankly incentivizes organizations and local actors to be able to collaborate for that sustainable development outcome. If not, it's simply just a piece of paper that to a certain degree sits on the shelf. It is really breathing life into that with those complementary elements that take a human-centric approach that makes sustainable development more practical.
That's brilliant. And I think something that stands out to me about that is the necessity for co-creation when it comes to sustainable development projects and when it comes to transitionary projects as well. I think that we've all acknowledged it's an ecosystem problem that requires an ecosystem solution. And I think quite interestingly, I'd like to get your perspectives on being from an NPO and running your own NPO. How does Sustainable Seas Trust view the role of nonprofit organizations as adapting to being more hands-on in creation of solutions as opposed to just receiving support to roll out the ideas of the private sector?
Look, I think the NPO, the NGO space is evolving. I think 10 years ago, it was a case of pretty much just taking handouts and implementing projects without real governance structures, financial management structures being put in place. But the way we run Sustainable Seas Trust is like a business, even though it's not profit driven. We need to have good governance in place. You need to have good financial structures in place. You need to have accountability, integrity, credibility, everything that speaks to good governance of finances and making sure that you are always accountable to those funders, those donors, those grantors that have given you their money. At the same time, accountable to your beneficiaries and making sure that that money is not just thrown into a project that won't have an exit strategy for SST and then won't build sustainability into the project. The way we operate is we co-create our design interventions with the communities, but we build in a way for them to take on the project themselves So we put in resources, we put in training, and we always have an exit strategy, because in my view, if the project fails when Sustainable Seas Trust exits, then the project is a failure. And if the community hasn't taken it on and taken it in with themselves to actually take on, then it's a failure. So that's the way the NGO sector has shifted. My concern with the NGO sector in general is that it's also a bit of a pissing contest, because we're all vying for the same
the Wild
funding,
West.
which is ridiculous. I mean, you talk about egos in the corporate sector. The egos exist in the NGO sector too. It's just a different manifestation of an ego, because you are vying for the same funding. And that's the system that's been built up, is that NGOs are meant to be doing good, but then they end up getting caught up in the red tape trying to get the funding to do good. So I think the system needs to shift as well in that sense.
And what I love about the sustainability space and the NGO space as well is you interact with, like yourself and your team from Sustainable Seas Trust, broader NGOs as well. And one thing is abundantly clear: everyone's exceptionally passionate about what they do. And is exceptionally passionate about making a meaningful difference in communities and in the world as a whole, right? You are the final frontier when it comes to us actually battling this at a grassroots level. I'd love to know, based on your experience, what pushed you in that direction? I can imagine, and maybe I stand to be corrected, but you probably didn't grow up young wanting to go in and run an NPO, right? What was the final little spark that ignited this and you decided, I need to be part of Sustainable Seas Trust, I need to be part of something bigger than myself?
Well, actually, to correct you, I did actually grow up wanting to be in the NGO space. I didn't know what it was called. I didn't know what it was called.
Okay.
But I knew that I wanted to be in the environmental governance, conservation, sustainability space. But I studied marine biology, so I studied pure science. And then I realized that I didn't want to sit in my glass tower just doing science and not having some sort of application, some sort of practical meaning behind the work that I was doing. So that pushed me into the space of taking the science and making it accessible to communities and making sure that there's the benefit from the work that we do. I did foray in the corporate sector.
As we all do.
But I realized that for me, I wanted to make sure that the energy that I put into the work that I do, it's going to leave the world a better place when I leave. And I didn't feel that way in the corporate sector. It felt to me like I was driving someone else's profit margin, as opposed to making sure that the legacy, there's something left in the world when I leave that makes the world a better place. And not because anyone remembers my name. It's not about that. It's not about me being remembered. I need the work to speak for itself and to leave the world a better place in that way.
Brilliant. They say sustainability is about living on this earth as if you're to live here forever. And I think that's brilliant. So Deloitte, obviously, we're very passionate about purpose beyond profit. And I think, Freedom, based on your experience, I'd love to understand, you obviously have a very diverse background, similar to myself, but what pushed you in the direction of sustainability? Why are we sitting here today really calling to question some of the big issues we're facing across the African continent?
Well, I could give you the long version, but I don't want to run us over time. When I went initially to university, I wanted to be a medical doctor, right? The grounding being I wanted to have a positive impact.
You're still saving lives. So
This is what we're here for. But I wanted to have that positive impact. And then over time, I learned that there's many ways to have that positive impact. Just because you can doesn't mean that you should. You need to be able to find the right application, the right environment that is most efficacious for the application of your skills. And what I found was leveraging the diplomacy, the international relations, the international legal skills. That was where I was able to really sing in many ways. I was able to find my place. When I went to the United Nations, this is where it all kind of hit home, right? So as you can imagine, as a young scholar with great ambition, you get given your UN badge and it's now your ticket to saving the world independently.
Chest out and head high.
Absolutely. And then in my first day at the Commission for Sustainable Development, I hear a story of a lady from Bangladesh who is talking about how she has to go a great distance for water at great risk of sexual assault. And this, in many ways, was quite sobering to me. So I found myself sitting and questioning, how was I going to have this impact that I was so passionate about? And truly, a German delegate came and sat me down at the United Nations and had a very formative conversation with me. And what he said was that there are 198 member states with very unique developmental dynamics. And you need to understand that wide spectrum of perspectives authentically. So Secondly, you need to understand the international legal architecture, the rules of the road. How is the treaties developed? What's the implication on those member states? In many ways, it's a widely global north developed mechanism, which is subsequently impacting those in the developing and emerging economies. So this creates a unique dynamic. And then the third sphere is you need to understand international political economy, the power dynamics of money. He said only through understanding each of those given spheres are you able to manifest change. And then more practically, you need to understand that this is not going to happen overnight. It's going to take 50 years. You need to be comfortable with incremental change, and you need to be very resilient in what you are doing. And so coming out of that experience at the Commission for Sustainable Development sent me on a course of action where I learned to try to be as specialist as possible in each of those spheres to be able to take the mosaic of experiences and translate that into practical action. At the international level now, it's really about moving the commanding heights of our economy in what is a very short period of time. It took us 60, 80 years to be able to build an economy that moves and that advances the quality of life that we have currently. We now need to reform the totality of that economy, not a singular sector, in what ultimately is about 7 years before we start very seriously breaching some of those planetary boundaries with almost irreversible impact. That is where I think the imperative is now, right? No one needs to wake me up each day and say, you need to go do some work, right? It's about finding that passion, finding that place where you're able to make a tangible impact. And in this case, it's moving the main economic actors into the green economy of the future as fast as possible.
Now, something that's quite interesting about that is you mentioned a lot of different timelines. And something that's really irks me is we have a lot of big corporates that are going back on a lot of their targets in terms of sustainability because they set targets that were too ambitious on the premise that they won't be around to be held accountable for not achieving those targets. And linking to that, I feel as though the youth have a huge role to play in any energy transition efforts and in any sustainability-oriented efforts going forward, right? I'm a very passionate One Young World ambassador, and something that really stood out to me when I attended One Young World, we had some phenomenal plenaries from people like Dr. Sylvia Earle, who I know you know quite well. But what really stood out was the power of the youth and the innovations and solutions that are already coming through. I think about Jack from Lighthouse, where they're repurposing laptops throughout Australasia and then setting up computer labs in Papua New Guinea. I think about Francisca Troutman from Glass Half Full, where there was no way to recycle glass in Louisiana, and now they've started breaking it down right into silica form, putting it in coffee roastery bags, which are obviously organic and biodegradable, and then using that to rebuild different portions of land that are actually being sort of taken over by the rising waters. And I think about that innovation, and that's what spurred me in the direction of sustainability. I sat down one day because, having gone through law school, I worked in supply chain for a while. I worked in cybersecurity of all things for a while. But what really was the defining moment for me was hearing all of these individuals speak about the difference that they're making with the limited resources that they have and the limited exposure that they have, simply grabbing a problem by the scruff and making a change and figuring things out as they went along. And I knew in that moment that I had to repivot my life and drive towards sustainability. But I do see some polarizing perspectives that have been shared recently. So if I think about Deloitte's recent Millennial and Gen Z survey results that got published, some key statistics for me are that 46% of Gen Zs are actively changing what industry they work in to be in a more environmentally friendly industry. 54% of Gen Zs are putting pressure on their employers to become more sustainable. And 64% of Gen Zs are actually looking for new opportunities because they don't believe that their employers are living sustainable practices. When I look at trends across the Gen Z sector, I see some decisions that don't quite make a lot of sense. So we've seen a huge buy into things like fast fashion recently, specifically across the African continent. And I think I'm disappointed as a Gen Z to see that on one hand, we're driving the implementation of more sustainable practices, but our actual choices aren't aligning to that. I'd love to get some neutral perspectives from you, Janine, first on, do you think Gen Zs are all talk and no action? How do you think Gen Zs, millennials, and even Gen Alphas who are coming through now can start to be taken more seriously in a corporate aspect and start to really live the values that they preach? I think it's quite key to get any traction. We obviously have a couple of young climate activists who are doing all sorts of things, maybe for the right reasons, but in the wrong way, and it's getting a lot of attention. But we don't want to be known as this loud generation that's all bark and no bite. Based on your perspectives, maybe share a little bit about what role you think these generations should play in building sustainable futures, and how we can start coming across as more authentic and co-creating solutions with industry role players.
Look, I definitely think there's a role for the activist side of things. I just don't think that it's sustainable personally. But I think there's a role for it. I think, though, that there is a little bit of bark and no bite in terms of, and I'm not just talking about Gen Z and Gen Y, I'm talking across the board, people that are interested in sustainability, but they're not actually willing to do the hard work, because being sustainable and living lightly on the planet, it's not easy. Unfortunately, I wish it was, but it's not. It's a matter of remembering to take your water bottle to the gym and getting your smoothie at the gym put in your reusable cup. It's a matter of thinking about how much water you're using within your own household and reusing your shower water to flush the toilet. It's a matter of not investing in fast fashion and saving a little bit more and buying clothes that last for a long time. It's a matter of thinking about where you're getting your technology from. It's a matter of when you're buying your meat, thinking about sustainable options for your meat.
Purchasing locally, right?
Say again?
Purchasing locally.
Purchasing locally, but also purchasing free range and well raised. So those options are not always cheaper. In fact, most of the time they're not cheaper. They're a lot more expensive, and it requires a little bit more thinking. It requires a little bit more planning. It requires discipline. And I do think that the younger generation isn't particularly disciplined around making those kind of decisions. That's a generalization. It's not across the board. So yes, there's a little bit of bark and no bite. Like, we need to do a little bit more in terms of disciplining ourselves to be more sustainable on the planet.
And that's a fair critique, right? Who's to say just because you're younger, you shouldn't be leading by example? And I think that I've got a lot of colleagues and friends who do that. They actually go the extra length. I'm not saying everybody should go and be a vegan, because there's also some challenges involved with that. But for example, if you purchase a loaf of bread from a local bakery, let's say it's a 500-gram loaf of bread, the carbon equivalent that's embedded in that is about 600 grams. If you buy that loaf of bread from a wholesale manufacturer who distributes from regions into your local supermarket, the carbon equivalent is about 900 grams. And that's a significant difference, right? 30% just by choosing to support local. Not only does it start endorsing local businesses, creating new employment and growth opportunities for those industries, but it's small ways that we can start to make an impact. And I believe that specifically across Africa, where we are a young continent, by changing purchase behaviors, we're able to put pressure on private sector and industry to rejig supply chains, to rejig what we're putting out there, to reposition things, change and question how we're doing things. Freedom, what's your perspective? I know globally there's a lot of movements around youth, and based on your experience, do you believe that we have a key role to play in these transitions?
I think youth are essential to being able to take the work that's being done right now, be it enough or not, and continue that going forward. Frankly, sustainable development, fostering those outcomes across a changing climate, is the defining factor of our generation, and will in many ways define how future generations look at us. I think part of this is that our generation, those who are in leadership positions now, need to understand and own that future. This goes back to your point on the ambitious targets, right? I think it's incredibly important to take this moonshot perspective, to be very bold in setting a direction for an organization, for a government, for a municipality that may be difficult to attain. But part of that moonshot thinking is articulating a vision which is bold and then galvanizing actors around that. I also equally think that young people need to be provided with authentic opportunities to contribute. You've seen this shift at the international level now, most recently with the creation of a youth high-level champion. This was agreed at COP28. This isn't to say that youth weren't very prevalent at the international negotiating space before. It was frankly how I entered into the United Nations, was as a youth delegate. So these inroads did exist and have existed for many years. But I think being able to elevate those voices now is very important, giving them authentic opportunities to contribute, listening to those voices, and then, as you said, being able to help inform what those decision choices look like for them in their personal life so that they can live this purpose at an early stage, that they can disseminate that knowledge amongst their friends, that they can raise those choices at their family or school or city level, and that collectively that is how we start to internalize sustainable development. The only way that this is going to be successful is that where the communities feel ownership over these goals. We can't prescribe a particular approach and expect people to respond. They need to see connection to those outcomes. They need to feel ownership in that space. And this is your point from the Gen Z millennial surveys. When they're not seeing that, they're looking actively for alternatives. I think it is contingent on our current generation of leaders to create those opportunities where we can have intergenerational dialogue, learn from one another, and continue to advance those sustainable development outcomes with authenticity. But at the same time, we need to also be aware that young people are very keen to have an impact. They don't want to wait 20 years to do so. They want to be integrated now. And by being able to create these forums within an organization, within a city, within a government, where we have these intergenerational exchange, I think is the start of a conversation which will ultimately have the passing of a baton to our next generation, from me, from her, to you, to be able to lead that charge going forward.
Thanks, Freedom Kai. I think you've summed it up incredibly well. It's conversations like these that we need to have more of. We need to understand that together we don't have all the solutions yet, but we can find them. I think to close, a final thought, sustainability is here to stay, or we may not be.